From the News Channel 5 network, this is Inside Politics.
Hello, everyone. I'm News Channel 5's political analyst, Pat Nolan. Welcome to Inside Politics. We are now into the third week of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's been expected the Russian army would rather easily conquer its neighbor, but that has not been the case so far, although the Russians continue to double down in their efforts to win by striking civilian targets with intense bombing and indiscriminate shelling. A maternity ward and even a pediatric hospital were also bombed and attacked this week. Charges of war crimes are being leveled against Russia and its president, Vladimir Putin, as a humanitarian disaster has also been created with over 2 million refugees and counting now seeking shelter. Vanderbilt professor of law, Michael Newton, is an expert in this area of the conduct of hostilities. He joins us on Inside Politics this week. Professor, thank you so much for being a part of the program.
Thanks, Pat. It's good to be here. I appreciate the time and the energy, and more importantly, the professionalism in focusing on this really important set of topics.
In layman's terms, what constitutes a war crime?
Well, the basic idea is that there are constraints on the way we wage war, not only how we wage war, but against whom. And this idea goes back thousands of years in civilization. So the basic idea is that you've exceeded the viable constraints. And the law of war is a sophisticated structure. I hope we have time to explain some of those details.
Okay, based on what you've seen and heard so far in the media accounts and what else you may have heard in talking to people within your sphere of influence and contacts, are the Russians committing war crimes in their conduct of this invasion of Ukraine?
You know, I tend to be less of a lawyer. You know, I'm a prosecutor, so absolutely, yes, they are committing war crimes. The challenge, though, for me is always not to just have broad political rhetoric, but to document specific cases against specific individuals beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's the challenge. So when you hear somebody say there are war crimes, yes, there appear to be violations of the laws of war. That's very different from saying we've got specific credible evidence against this general or this battalion commander or Vladimir Putin himself. And I think we have to be very conscious of building viable criminal cases where we don't commingle the political rhetoric, which is totally appropriate, with the legal standards necessary to prove specific cases.
Let me give you an example and talk about the bombing of the maternity hospital and also the pediatric wards over in Ukraine. Those would appear to be on their face, and when you've seen the video, a potential war crime. But the difficulty is determining not just what happened, but who's responsible for what happened.
Well, yeah, I mean, the crime is intentionally directing attacks against civilians. I mean, the very foundation of the law of war is that there's a valid class of participants and objects. We call them military objects, military targets in the protocol. And then the idea is that the law serves as a buffer to protect innocent lives, civilians. It's essentially human rights law, but in the specific context of an armed conflict. That's why lawyers call it lex specialis. It's the special body of law. And so when you attack civilians intentionally, that's a war crime.
Now,
if you use a weapon that doesn't distinguish between combatants and civilians, that's a war crime. So on the hospital, there's just an evidentiary issue.
There's been a lot of talk directly that Russian President Vladimir Putin is actually guilty of war crimes, but I suspect he's going to be the hardest person of all to prove that he's actually been responsible for them.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, in the law of war, we have a doctrine called the law of command responsibility, which says you're responsible directly as a direct perpetrator for anything that your subordinates do if you knew or should have known. So Vladimir Putin, if he's charged on a command responsibility theory, would have to prove, which of course cuts against his personality and ego, all of it happened and I had no knowledge and I didn't get any reports and I didn't care. I think those things are factually very difficult for Putin to establish. And here, when you talk about Putin as a war criminal, the most important thing is what forum and under what body of law. In the International Criminal Court, that problem is easily solved by virtue of the structure of the Rome Statute. So yes, Putin could be charged at the ICC, no question.
Now, I understand there's already some kind of inquiry or investigation going on at the International Criminal Court looking into what exactly has happened. And what particular area are they looking at for potential war crimes against not just Russia, but Putin himself?
Well, the International Criminal Court inquiry is based on either territoriality or nationality. Ukraine when Crimea was occupied back in 2014, did what's called a 12-3 referral. They asked the ICC to intervene. And so there's been a long-standing set of analysts looking at Ukraine and looking at the occupation law issues. Of course, in light of recent events, it's taken on an incredible sense of urgency. So the ICC is looking at the targeting issues. They're looking at occupation law issues. And it's notable that you've now had 39 other states parties to the Rome Statute, specifically requesting the court. So that investigation has begun, but I do want to add one note of caution. Remember that the ICC, in the very best case, would only do 2, maybe 3 cases. That doesn't come anywhere close to the scope of Russian officers and leaders responsible, and so we have to have a comprehensive effort, which I can talk about if you'd like.
What would be the process for the ICC first? Is this going to take some months to get this done, because it's happened pretty quickly? And does this become part of any negotiations, let's say, to end the war in Ukraine? Because obviously Vladimir Putin's going to try to fight this, not just the war, but also what's going on in terms of these charges.
What a great insight, Pat. You come at this almost like a seasoned professional. I mean, one of the big debates in my field always has been this peace versus justice trade-off. In the early days of the ICC, this came up in the context of Joseph Kony, actually, and Uganda. And the ICC prosecutor's policy is that the interests of justice, which is a phrase from the Rome Statute, the interests of justice are standalone and separate from the interests of peace. In other words, the ICC process has nothing to do with peace negotiations or politics. It's a legal process, completely independent, and designed to be essentially extraneous to political negotiations. So the ICC is not going to go away. It's just not.
There are concerns.
You can't bargain it away. You can't negotiate it away. There's just no way. And by the way, remember, there's no statute of limitations either.
There is some concerns that as this war continues, and particularly as the Russians continue to find ways to double down to win what's going on in the conflict, that they might employ either biological or chemical weapons. Those, in many cases, are already outlawed, but are still sometimes used in warfare. Would those potentially be war crimes? And is it more serious that they would be used, perhaps, even if perhaps they've been warned that they might be a war crime?
Well, here we get back to the big picture law of deterrence. Absolutely, they would be war crimes, in primary part because of the nature of the weapon. So that's what we call means and methods. The very means of waging warfare is in itself criminal under the Rome Statute and customary international law. But it's doubly criminal because those are indiscriminate weapons, right? So if you use a chemical weapon, particularly in a civilian area, it's tantamount to directly, intentionally attacking civilians who are otherwise legally protected. The challenge here is one of deterrence. And there's a lot to be said about the nature of waging war and taking the initiative away from the enemy and deterring. And I think, if we're concerned about chemical weapons, of course, or tactical nukes, there's been discussion of that, we have to be very upfront about deterring them and not just in legal terms, but also in military terms. That is unacceptable, is not an acceptable tactic, and here's what we will do about it.
Professor Michael Newton is our guest on Inside Politics. He's a Vanderbilt law professor. He's also an expert in the area of the conduct that should be given in how to conduct hostilities across the world. Back to continue our conversation with the professor after you watch these messages.